Hi, welcome to my talk, Understanding Modern Turn-Based Tactical Design. Nailed it. I haven't managed to say it once correctly. My name is Rawski. I'm the lead game designer at Artificer. Before that, I was, like many people at Artificer, a game designer at Creative Forge Games. There I made the games Hard West, it's Scars of Freedom DLC, and Phantom Doctrine, so two pretty notable entries in the tactical turn-based game genre. And since then I've been working as a lead game designer at Artificer, where I've been working on Homicidal All-Stars. So this gives me 8 years of experience with this genre. Okay. Here it is. So in case it wasn't clear, when I'm talking about turn-based tactical games, I'm talking really about kind of turn-based shooters. So the pattern's pretty clear here. They all look kind of like Gears of War or something. So I'm talking about, more specifically, this family of tactical games. So in the 90s, when many of us probably grew up with games like Jagged Alliance and the old XCOM games, there's also Incubation here and Silent Storm. And then, of course, what happened eventually is that we got almost exactly 10 years ago. So 10 years ago tomorrow is actually going to happen the release of XCOM Enemy Unknown. So as you know, it's like this game that rebooted the whole genre, standardized everything, and since then, kind of every game in the genre is referred to as an XCOM clone. But so what this did, XCOM, is, so it revived the genre and it standardized things. But it has split into many very different kinds of games, actually. So the games you see here on the right side, they're all very different titles, actually. They share a few things established by XCOM, but actually these developers have all done very different things with it. Okay, and so there's been a shift in the genre, and so games in the genre have been moving towards, so my 5 points of good game design towards my 5 points of good game design. So first off, what's been happening is that these games are being moved towards being able to make meaningful, informed decisions. So the player is more informed, they can better anticipate outcomes, and and the next thing is more dynamic gameplay. So what was pretty common in tactical turn-based games in the past was that the combat was pretty static. So it was often about attrition, and there wasn't much movement or many options during the combat. So now it's very dynamic, and there's variable feedback. So this is a term I learned from A Theory of Fun. So the player has a sense of how well they are doing. It's being communicated to them. So pretty much all good games have this in some form. Like even if a game is well designed, it can be pretty boring if the player doesn't have the sense that they are doing well. And of course, intuitiveness and accessibility. So these games are more and more easy to learn and to master. And and finally, of course, freshness. So these games usually come with something that really makes them distinct among their competitors. So so this is a game I'm working on. I'm going to briefly describe it. I'm not here to promote it officially, but so it's a turn-based tactical game. Obviously, it has turn-based combat. It has real-time exploration. So we walk around in top-down or third-person and explore a city. It has a cyberpunk theme, as you can tell by the neon lights and flames and everything. It has retro campiness, so it's very inspired by 80s and 90s action cinema. And it's cartoonishly violent, so humans are basically just blood balloons waiting to pop, lots of gips and gore. And it's character-driven, so there is a story which is very much driven by characters, but also all controllable characters are actually, a unique class and have a different purpose during combat. And, well, obviously there are RPG elements, like in pretty much all games in this genre. So you have experience points, you level up, you have a skill tree, and so on. And this game is handcrafted, which sets it apart from many other games in this genre, most notably XCOM. So every piece of cover, every wall, every enemy, everything was placed by hand by a human being. And finally, it's a game show. So this game has a setting kind of inspired by Running Man. So we have an announcer who comments on the entire action. there is a show director who sometimes gets involved. He will sometimes affect the action, like release gas into the arena or something like that. And, well, if you're in other things, oh yeah, and during exploration you have like puzzles and traps to disarm. So it's kind of like, you know, like resolving Riddler trophy stuff in the Arkham series. And our design goals for this game have been a smaller scope, but top quality. So smaller scope compared to Phantom Doctrine, which was of a similar scope as XCOM. So this time we decided, no, we're going to totally focus on the combat, and we want it to be as good as possible, and highly dynamic combat. So I'm going to explain in more detail later what I mean by that. Diverse memorable levels. So we chose a philosophy much like in single-player action games for this game. And, well, kick-ass player abilities. So we want the player to have many unique tools to use over the course of the game. And also large enemy roster. So we have many enemies who are mechanically unique. And, well, it's accessible. So we want this to be a good first choice for someone who hasn't had any experience in this genre, but also we wanted to keep it fresh and rewarding to veterans, which is kind of in conflict with the accessibility maybe, but I think we've managed to resolve it. And finally, a goal was fun gameplay, which may sound a bit provocative, as if most games in the genre weren't designed to be fun, but I feel that there is kind of this idea that strategic games, they have other priorities than being fun. And personally, I feel that it's neglecting what you can do with this kind of game. Sorry, I need a bit of water. Sorry, recovering from a cold here. So yeah, those are the standard mechanics of the genre, and this time we've decided to use all of them. So this is the stuff that XCOM pretty much standardized. So the first thing is the action point system, which is based on 2 AP. So the basis is you either move far or you move a bit and shoot. That's the basis of this system. And of course, when abilities come in, there are more options, so you can then combine it like, okay, I'm going to cast an ability, then shoot, or I'm going to cast 2 abilities, and stuff like that. So it's a pretty nice system because it's, well, there is no number crunching like in the past. It's instantly clear how much you can do and what. And it's the constant. It's not data that's different between characters, so there's less to memorize and study. And, sorry. And, oh yeah, and the cool thing is that you're usually able to deplete all resources. So in more complex systems, you're usually left with these remainder points and stuff, and here it's very clean, especially if you include an ability that allows you to always sensibly conclude a turn, so like spamming Overwatch or Hunker Down in XCOM. And the 2 AP system is actually a double package with attacks and turn. So this is a rule which is very important. It's easy to neglect it, because, so what ending the turn does on attacks is the player chooses not only whom to attack, he also chooses what the other side will have to deal with. So this instantly guarantees a certain symmetry in the combat, and importantly, it instantly eliminates very annoying strategies like aggressive retreat. So in Phantom Doctrine it was actually possible to do that. We had a more complex action point economy, and what was possible was that one side is constantly shooting and retreating out of the line of fire, and the other side is completely defenseless. And so this system makes stuff like that impossible. So we've decided this time to stick with it. The next thing is faction-wide turns. So quite a few turn-based games obviously use like these timelines where different units act at a different moment. And we've decided against it for one basic reason. We believe that a game in this genre is best when the player is able to plan out a complex turn, when all the characters work together, all their abilities, you know, the synergy between them is utilized. And that's not really possible in our opinion if there is stuff happening between the actions of all the players' characters. So that's why we felt it was essential to let the player plan out and execute the actions of their entire team instantly. And, well, this time we stuck with random hit chances and damage. We've actually experimented with this stuff a lot in the past, in Hard West especially, but also in Phantom Doctrine. And it worked okay in Hard West, but in Phantom Doctrine we made a mistake, which I'm going to explain in more detail later. So this time we decided to stick with the standard of the genre, but I will explain in great detail what the problems are with RNG. And finally, the cover system. So everyone's seen it probably. There is full cover and low cover, or high cover and low cover. And so this is obviously cool because it instantly applies strategic values to positions on the map. It's something that old turn-based games often didn't have. So especially if you play a game like Jagged Alliance, you may feel that it's missing and unclear. So it's very important to have this in any turn-based tactical game, which is about shooting. Okay, I feel like I'm missing a slide here. But okay, so one thing that I think is important to understand is that planning is playing. Because I feel that turn-based games are, so there's a bit of a paradox when you look at a turn-based game at first, because in real-time games, there's nothing happening if nothing's happening on the screen. And with turn-based games, it's basically the opposite. The player is actually playing the game when nothing's going on. They're observing the level, they're making decisions, they're iterating through all the possible moves. So a few years ago I learned that Brian Upton calls this anticipatory play. So the player is walking through all the possible moves and also what can happen to them. And so you may think that when nothing's going on in the game and the player is just watching the screen, that they're bored and you should do something about it. But actually they're probably having a really great time. But also the opposite is true, waiting is not playing. So, especially when something really cool is going on the screen, it may be that the player is pretty bored because they're just waiting to get their turn back. So I think it's very important to be aware of this. So yeah, turn-based does not mean slow-paced. When I went into this genre as a developer like 8 years ago, I still had this idea that turn-based games are the slow and kind of boring thing. It's what they're supposed to be. But no, XCOM pretty much established that no, that's not how it should be. And slow pace is actually devastating in turn-based games. So one thing you have to understand is that turn-based games are instant. They aren't slow, they're infinitely fast. And actually any delay in a turn-based game slows the game down. And so we must be very selective about every single delay in the game. Okay, every single delay must have a purpose. So all the, for instance, the animations during the player turn, they are there for flavor, so the player receives a payoff when he executes an action. But all delays during the enemy turn, they're mostly there so the player is informed. He can keep track of the action because it's easy, to doze off during the enemy turn or, to miss something that happened. Like often in this genre, the player misses something as big as losing a character. It's their turn again and like, oh, holy crap, I lost a guy. So yeah, that's why you need these delays in the enemy turn. And in a modern tactical game, it's essential that you speed it up. So there are these standard things that you should do. You want to assure responsiveness and quick movement. So all the animations should be pretty quick and satisfying. And the next thing is that you want to achieve simultaneous movement where possible. So something that, for instance, XCOM allows is that you can already give the next move order while your previous guy is still moving. Or what Gears Tactics did is they actually often move enemies as a group at once. So this is really great. It really speeds up the action. If you can do it, do it. What we, for instance, do is when reinforcements spawn for the enemies, an entire squad, we let them walk into the arena at once. Oh yeah, and a very big thing is something that Mutant Year Zero introduced. So have like this fast forward on demand in the game. So we have like this prompt on the screen during the enemy turn, hold down a button, and the action is sped up like twice. And I think every turn-based game should have something like this at this point. But remember, while speeding up, clear communication. You want to make sure that the player is able to keep track of the action of the enemy. But in all of this, remember that flavor actually matters also in this genre. I think there is also still this idea that graphics and satisfying shots and stuff like this doesn't matter in turn-based game quite as much as in an action game. But I think that's a misconception. I think when you're doing a high-budget turn-based game, this stuff is just as important. Like we have a VFX guy who's he's invested years into our blood effects. We have put a lot of work into the hit sounds. And it's a completely different experience than it used to be before we added this stuff, far more satisfying. So if you have a game with a realistic presentation, high budget and so on, then you should totally go for flavor also and remember this while speeding up the game So you don't want, something like Heroes of Might and Magic 3 today, where everyone's like, and it's ugly. But everybody has played Heroes of Might and Magic 3 this way, right? Always at maximum speed. So the reason is that you don't want to wait. The action is instant. All of the animation is just Okay, I'm going to take another sip before this very heavy topic. So, the simulated baggage. Also, when I went into the genre, almost 8 years ago, to me the ideal was Jagged Alliance 2. And that was a beast of a game with millions of systems and lots of parameters, lots of weird behaviors. It's a game that can do anything. And I think many developers will have a tendency to go into deep simulation when they make a turn-based game. The argument is kind of that, okay, it's turn-based, so the player has infinite time, so they can deal with any level of complexity, but that's simply not true. And there is also this false assumption that complexity makes games strategic, I think. What you actually want is complicated decisions, not a complex game. And complexity in the game mechanics does not necessarily lead to the latter. Actually, what you want is that the player gets a manageable number of options. You want that the player is able to iterate through all of them. As I said, it's kind of required for the anticipatory play to work. And if you have a simpler game, it's easier to process all the information, and it's easier to predict the consequences. So it facilitates these meaningful informed decisions that I mentioned earlier. And as a matter of fact, complexity can be disastrous. So something that happens a lot with complex games is that viable options get drowned in junk options. So the player, and what the player does is they will simplify anyway. So you have this game which, let's say for instance, it has like 1,000 options for the player in a turn, but they will learn the 5 options that work and they will not care about the rest. So that's why complexity is often pretty much worthless. And so the hard truth. Jagged Alliance had complex mechanics, but very shallow combat. Okay, I was afraid somebody would pull a Will Smith here. So yeah, I grew up with the idea that Jagged Alliance 2 is like one of the best games ever made. It's perfect, and every turn-based game has to be like Jagged Alliance and even better. But the truth is that Jagged Alliance had very boring combat. It was very static. There was very little movement during the combat. You didn't really have many options. So actually what you did most of the time was you moved your pile of characters, and then there was this little war of attrition without any interesting actions. You were able to set like the accuracy per shot, but actually you didn't do that. You just used always the maximum accuracy, because why not? So yeah, this is better. So these games have simpler mechanics, but they are more dynamic, and they have more interesting decisions for the player. So on the left side is Incubation, which is the oldest turn-based tactical game I know, which checks most boxes for a good modern turn-based tactical game. So it's just here, so you don't think them only going like new is better. There are actually good old games. But on the right side, obviously, XCOM, the reboot from 10 years ago, which set new standards and showed us the way how to do makes of this, how to make games of this kind. But to be fair, simulators are awesome, but they are a different beast, okay? They aren't designed like normal games are. They are designed to be interesting, to be something that's fascinating to study, or something that is supposed to be unpredictable and surprise you. And most game design wisdom that we have does not apply to simulators this way. And so as you can guess, we have chosen philosophy of reductionism for Homicidal All-Stars. So we made the encounter smaller, so it's usually like 3 against 5 to 8 enemies. We did less RNG and simplified the RNG. So actually, for instance, you can usually get a 100% hit chance in this game, and most abilities don't use RNG at all. We have completely focused on the health economy, because sometimes there are systems like armor that can be depleted, or in Phantom Doctrine we had like this bar we called awareness. So we got rid of stuff like that. It's entirely about dealing damage and avoiding it. Then we simplified Fog of War. We said this game is about combat, so let's make it. So let's not have this scouting and exploration in the combat. Let's focus just on maneuvering. So the fog of war that we have is just, new areas of the level are uncovered when you reach the next stage of the level. But it's not a game mechanic per se. In the meta gameplay, we have only progress. So it's not like in XCOM where you have this loop where you can also lose in the meta gameplay. Here it's basically everything outside the combat is just progress, really. I mean, you can die, but it's very content based, like in an action game. You can make a mistake and lose a bit, but you can always reset it a moment later. And and we only have one floor per level, so most games in the genre have like multiple elevations that you can switch between. We found it makes a game unnecessarily complicated. It makes the UX worse, and it doesn't contribute to better combat. Got rid of it. And and we reduce the number of stats, so there are no base stats like strength, dexterity, and stuff like that. We just said, okay, just let the player manipulate directly the stats that are relevant to the combat, so like melee damage, movement range, and stuff like that. And so the game isn't out yet, but we've done a lot of internal and external testing. Previews are coming in. There's a demo out there which you can play right now. And we've gotten pretty good feedback so far. So it seems that the results are that what's left is meaningful. So there's really nothing in this game left that doesn't matter. There's less information to communicate, and that in turn facilitates decision making. The player is more able to grasp everything, to understand their goals, and that's what we want, actually, that the player experiences. And it also speeds up the action, and it's generally more fun. The player gets payoffs more often. And it was also easier to design and develop. So here's the thing. When you're making a simpler game, you're actually designing the game. When you're designing a very complex game, what you're designing is the set of weird systems that hopefully eventually result in a certain kind of gameplay that you want. So we've been there, we've done that. Phantom Doctrine has suffered a lot from that. We're more obsessed with the question, what can the game do, than what it does. And this time we said, no, we want to make a game that just does cool stuff. And so we designed the stuff that it does, and the results have been good. And and so far all feedback has been positive, like about these changes. So once in a while somebody says, I would like critical damage, but nobody has said that he's missing something critical in our game. Okay, I need another sip, sorry. Right, and so as I said, these games are becoming more dynamic. So combat is movement, in my opinion, at least like realistic combat. There are of course more abstract games. You have games like Darkest Dungeon, for instance, or Slay the Spire, which have combat that is entirely about not geometry really. It has a very abstract solution for these things, but more typical forms of combat, they're always about moving and outflanking, getting into range, getting the right angles and stuff like that. And here's the thing, turn-based gameplay is perfect for this, because you have all the time in the world to study and analyze and to find these angles, the right moves and so on, and you can actually even do it for an entire squad, not just one character. So I think that the idea that turn-based games are about movement is a bit abstract, and I think it's very important to understand that they are very good at this. So when you're making a game like this, design all elements around movement. So what we did is we designed all the abilities around it. Every element on the levels was designed around how it's going to affect the movement of the player. The enemies were designed around movement, and so on. And we actually also planned out all the movement in the level design. So here at the bottom you actually see one of the designs for a level. So before we started implementing a level, I always want to see like some idea for how the movement's going to work. So this is actually the first level in the game, so it's very basic. But you instantly know where the player is going to move, where the enemies are going to move, and how they are going to affect each other. And what I think is very important is that you move or even flip the front sometimes. Because what happens a lot in strategy games is that they turn into this, as I said, this slow war of attrition. What we want is that the movement is going on, and one of the most beautiful things in a game is when the player has to make a bigger decision. And so without movement, there aren't such decisions really, because you're just, pushing ahead and just repeating the same step. So what was important to us was that we sometimes make this big game changer. So suddenly reinforcements come in from the back, And those are the moments where you really make a big decision again in the combat, because suddenly you have to look at everything you have to restudy the battlefield and make a really big decision. And that's something that too few games do. So actually we were inspired, I think, by Gears of War here, the shooter, not Gears Tactics, which did stuff like that. Or Resident Evil also did this a lot. So the results have been pretty wonderful, I think. Yeah, of course, always remember to offer strong approach options. It's easy to forget this when you're designing levels. You want to have a path that's pretty easy to use for the player to advance. So usually the first iterations of our levels, they have been lacking this stuff, and the player would prefer to sit on their ass just in the back and play defensively. So it's important that all the levels offer the player a pretty strong path to advance, and also use soft pressure to motivate movement. So what we did a lot is, for instance, we have, as I said, we have a game show theme, and one of the things we added was battle highlights. It's a form of kill streaks, so these reward pretty dynamic, aggressive play. The enemies are designed to often put soft pressure on the player. So, for instance, we have tankier enemies who push you out, when we have enemies who reel you in because you can't really hurt them from a distance. And we also have, for instance, health stations on the level. So when you're injured, you have a reason to move through the level. So everything in the game is redesigned around motivating the player to move. And the result is a very fun and dynamic game. And of course, when making a game like this, it's critical that you do full information. So the single worst thing you can do in a tactical game is not allow the player to make informed decisions. Because making decisions is all you do in a turn-based game. You don't have this, this visceral experience like in action games where even a trivial thing without decisions can be satisfying. So, yeah, and it's also, I think, the area where the turn-based genre has advanced the most over the years. So, if you compare modern turn-based games like Mutant Year Zero or Gears Tactics to XCOM, the reboot, going back to XCOM is actually a very painful experience because you're missing pretty basic information like what hit chances you're going to have from where before you move. So yeah, that's an area where the genre is advancing very much. So what you should do is provide as much information as you can. So we have examples here. So for instance, what we do is we not only show the hit chances, we actually even emphasize perfect shots. Or we show on the icons of the enemies that, yeah, this guy is actually going to die if he receives this damage. And this is another thing where a simpler game helps you, because a simpler game has less information to communicate, so you can actually deliver all information without overloading the interface and so on. And yeah, and also you want to actively warn the player sometimes. So, for instance, when you're planning a path through an Overwatch area or something, make it clear, remind the player, oh, if you do this, something dangerous is going to happen. And also, obviously, help following the action. So we have done a lot of stuff. So for instance, we have something we call floating texts. So every time an enemy does something more complicated than shooting, we actually display what action they've executed. Or, when a player character dies, we actually make a really big custom camera angle for it so the player can possibly miss this fact. And I can't really read this, it's pretty small. Okay, actually this was all, sorry. Okay. So yeah. No! Okay. So yeah, when you go into turn-based games, you will probably have the same expectation I had when I worked on Phantom Doctrine and Art West. Turn-based games are abstract by default. Like a turn-based system is not realistic. It's well, it's abstract. So yeah, this does give you a lot of freedom in the mechanics, but well, there are limitations. The thing is, especially if you go for realistic presentation like we did, like how XCOM did, and so on, the player expects the game to behave in a certain way, right? And so yeah, abstract solutions need more testing. We did abstract solutions in the past. So for instance, in Phantom Doctrine, what I mentioned about RNG was we did like this awareness system. Because we wanted to get rid of RNG, we knew players hate RNG, so let's do something about it. So we did like these bars for every character that get depleted. So every shot that misses depletes this awareness. and when it's depleted, then all shots will hit. The problem is it didn't feel like actual gunfights. It felt really weird. It wasn't shooting to the player. It's not natural that first every shot misses and then every shot hits. And that's the problem. The problem was that we underestimated, we overestimated how abstract these games are for the player. And we really didn't test it enough. I mean, it made sense on paper. It was a pretty good mechanic, but it didn't feel right. So when you're working on abstract games and develop abstract mechanics, you need to do far more testing than you'd have to do anywhere else. And yeah, so the elephant in the room, RNG. I can't talk about this genre without going into RNG. So when you're designing a turn-based game, you expect that geniuses will play your game. You think it's going to be card-counting sharks who get thrown out of casinos in Vegas, but you get this guy. So why players hate RNG? So they think it makes my choices worthless. I'm sure many of us here have actually felt this way, like we've developed a great plan, we're fucking geniuses, and the plan failed because the RNG gods weren't on my side, right? So the thing is this, actually what happens is the players make the wrong choices because randomness is manageable if you know the chances. As I said, there are poker tournaments, there are magic tournaments, and somehow it works. So why doesn't it work in XCOM magically, right? So the thing is this, humans suck at randomness in general. Oh, so humans suck at randomness in general. It's a scientifically proven fact. And there's this thing that's called the crooks. So that's what happens when a game behaves differently than expected. So it's pretty much the worst thing that can happen in a game. It's a worst experience that the player can have. So they have a certain expectation that something good is going to happen, and their understanding of the game suggests that that's going to happen, but then something devastating happens, and that's a moment where players rage quit. And the thing is that RNG is pretty much destined to create cruxes because players don't understand randomness. But now the question, how come that so many games have RNG, pretty much all of them do, but XCOM is the one that's getting so much shit for it? So yeah, the thing is that XCOM has devastating outcomes. Like random rolls constantly cause terrible consequences that will last, for hours. So you build up your characters over many hours, you build your skill trees, and one bad roll and they're dead. And even if they don't die, they will suffer psychological trauma, and oh my god. So it's honestly a bit of a nightmare to play the game, but also, of course, satisfying for different reasons. But that's the problem with RNG, really, the outcomes. So the question is, why do we even do RNG? So the cool thing about RNG is it allows to easily simulate very complex things, like, as I said, shooting combat. So you expect that the shots will miss sometimes they hit, and so on. But when you're making a game like this, you're not actually simulating the shooting, right? So RNG allows us to simulate a thing like that. Or for instance, lockpicking. You don't have to, actually simulate lockpicking with a minigame or something. You can just make it a chance, and you get a pretty believable simulation of lockpicking in your game. And randomness also makes games feel less abstract and more organic. So these little amounts of unpredictability and so on, they just make it feel more real, because that's how we expect the world to work. And it's also a very convenient and unnoticed balancing tool. So as I said, players suck at noticing and understanding randomness, so you have lots of room to cheat, and you totally should cheat when you do RNG, always to the player's advantage. And there's also the thing that, again, it's scientifically proven, uncertainty causes a dopamine release. So in gambling, actually, even before the gambler knows the outcome, they already get this moment of satisfaction. So, that's a reason to have RNG there in itself, just, because this little amount of uncertainty just makes the game more satisfying to the player. Science. But yeah, RNG sucks when it decides the outcome of big things, and especially if it leads to implausible outcomes like close-up misses, like what you've seen on the previous slide there. Yeah, but this mostly applies to bad outcomes. With good outcomes, these things aren't such a problem. And yeah, and here's another big one. Each random roll creates another timeline. So if anybody here has watched Community, there was an episode about this where die roll generates several timelines. And that's true. So actually, every roll that has multiple possible outcomes, it actually creates more scenarios that the player should take into account when planning out their turn. And the problem is players don't do that. What they do is they pick their one plan based on their bad assumptions about RNG. So they pick one 50% shot here, one 50% shot here, one 50% shot here. Seems like a solid plan, right? Yeah, and then they bet all their cards on this one plan. Only like hardcore card counting sharks play this way, that they actually take into account all the possible outcomes generated by the random rolls. So yeah. So my advice is only sprinkle your game with randomness. Like these little accents. Don't make it, affect big stuff. Don't do more RNG than you have to. Focus on handling these things that you can't handle without RNG. And try to make RNG work the way people think it works. So, make unlikely outcomes literally impossible if they're bad, right? So, I mean, who has heard of, missing a 50% shot 2 times in a row? Unheard of. So, it's always clever to do these things in the background silently. Like, for instance, in our game, it's very, very, very unlikely to miss 2 times in a row, actually, at least on normal difficulty. Also, minimize negative impacts. As I said about XCOM, you want the consequences of bad random rolls not to hurt quite as much. And a very important rule, is that good strategies must always yield good results. So you can't really plan this out in advance on paper, but you must do like these regular tests of the game, play it and see if playing well will always have a good outcome. You have to replay the levels and make sure that it never happens that the player has done their best, they understood the game, and still they failed the level, they got a bad outcome, right? Yeah, and communicate the quality of the player's decisions. So, what I often see, for instance, is that that players, they don't even understand the cover system. They stand out in the open, and the problem is it sometimes works. They sometimes go out into the open and they survive, and then they think, that's a valid strategy. It's not suicidal at all. So that's a problem. RNG makes this variable feedback that I mentioned earlier pretty muddy and ineffective. So you should take other steps to communicate to the player. That's a very stupid thing you're doing right now, right? So you can color the hit chances red when they're low. You can, I don't know, you can tell the player that they've lucked out when they did. Like, a character acknowledging that, oh my God, that was like, woo, like God was watching over me or something when they survived, 3 hits in a row or something. And also make the outcomes of one event similar. So what I mean by that is that when you have a random roll, you can combine like a neutral, a good, and a great outcome. But you should avoid rolls that, for instance, can have a very good outcome and a devastating one. So, just imagine if you won a match in, I don't know, some multiplayer shooter, and you have the loot boxes there, and you get one of them, and 2 of them will give you a new item, and the 3rd option will take away an item from you. That would be pretty damn devastating and stupid. And yet, in turn-based games, we often do stuff like this. I've seen so many mechanics in games where the player is given the choice, and they do it, and on a strategic level where they make a choice, they have no other option. It's a random thing, and they can only decide, am I going to gamble? So what you should really do is try to at least, group together these outcomes. avoid situations where, when you perform an action, it can end devastatingly, even though it's like the best thing the player can do. So how we did it in Homicidal All-Stars. So hit chances only exist in shooting. You can regularly get 100% even with shooting. So we've made a simple rule that if you've outflanked an enemy and you've gotten into effective range, you get 100%. So this is our idea to handle this problem that players have. Players are so unable to handle RNG. Give them options which don't need RNG, and this also resolves the problem that I mentioned earlier, that close-up misses are pretty implausible, unbelievable, and frustrating. And it seems to have worked out pretty good. We did keep randomized damage for this organic feel, and so it doesn't become too static and boring. We avoided terrible long-term consequences. If you lose a character, they come back after the fight. We also did this player-friendly bias in the RNG. So as I said, we cheat to the player's advantage. The enemies are a bit of stormtroopers compared to the player's characters. And health and damage mildly favor the players, so generally the PCs will go down more slowly than the enemies. And the most unpredictable thing left in the game is actually enemy behavior, which is great, because, well, they're enemies, they should have agency. That's a good thing. And we also did many surprises in the level design, but we kept them fair. So as I said, it's a game show, so we have crazy stuff happening in the game, like, fighting on train tracks. Trains can run over your characters, or, the show director will control doors on the level. But we announce these things so the player can react, or we place them in the turn system at such a moment that the player has a chance to somehow respond to this. Okay, I'm going to take another sip now. So yeah, I'm so used to announcing things in the game that I'm announcing something like this. So abilities are everything. Wait, actually I have to check the time because I'm not sure if I'm doing well. Oh, okay, actually doing very badly. Okay, so let's do this quick. So abilities are everything in tactical games. They're the main source of strategic depth, really, in a modern turn-based tactical game. The great thing about them is they add complexity modularly, and not only for you as a developer, but also for the player. So what I mean is, every ability is like a mechanic of its own. And when you create many abilities for characters in your game, if you take them all together, you get a pretty complex game. But it's manageable. It's not like you're putting all the cards on this one feature of your game. Instead, you're always able to add or remove this one ability. So it's a very smart thing for you to do as a developer. And also, you can do easy onboarding for the player. You can introduce this over time. You can use it in the player progression. And also, abilities make characters and enemies unique. So every enemy type actually, enemies are mainly defined by their abilities, and that makes them unique challenges. So the problem with abilities is, where do they fit in? So the combat economy based on shooting and flanking, it's very demanding on its own. It already imposes how you should move around the levels and so on. And it's a problem we fought with a lot during the development of this game. And abilities also compete with shooting as the thing that the player should do. And reasonable abilities are bad. So by reasonable, I mean abilities that pay off mathematically or something, but the player doesn't see the instant payoff or attractiveness of this ability. So how we did do player abilities. First off, we decided to make abilities generally supplement shooting. So usually they're designed to help you shoot effectively. So for instance, they help you reposition so you can get these shooting angles, or they reposition the enemies, or they inhibit shooting or strengthen it. And for some abilities we found these windows, so they cover cases that shooting just doesn't. So for instance, melee attacks in our game have been a problematic issue, but in the end we found something. So they are always certain to hit, but they deal less damage than shooting. And shooting obviously has a larger range than melee attacks, but you can only move for one action point and then shoot. But with melee you can actually run in 2 AP distance and still hit. So in some contexts melee has larger attack range than shooting. And so that's the approach we chose to make abilities work alongside shooting. They're all designed to be impactful. Every ability has to do something pretty strong. We've avoided abilities that give you these little hit chance boosts, like okay, 5% of defense or something, which I don't know why developers do this stuff. So we just said, okay, let's make an ability that's called unhittable, and for one turn, the character is literally impossible to get hit. And players started actually using this ability, unlike XCOM Smoke Grenade, which if you Google it, actually you get the suggestion useless. So yeah, and this was a philosophy for us with all the abilities. We have an ability that's called Easy Target. It actually makes a unit impossible to miss. Our smoke does not provide a defense boost. It actually blocks lines of sight, like in Counter-Strike, stuff like that. And they usually have immediate effects. So for a time we had abilities that have a slightly delayed effect. But again, players never used it because the core economy in this game is about shooting and flanking, which has instant payoff and is juicy and satisfying. So we chose to do this with all the abilities as well. So for instance, we have this lure ability, which moves an enemy. It used to be that enemies would choose to go to it in their own turn. But nobody used it. So what we did then is instantly just move a character during your turn there, and everybody started using it because it actually, it supports this building of plans within your own turn, which, as I said, is pretty much the coolest thing about this genre. And they have at least one clear purpose. So every ability should have one context in the game where it's clear to the player they should use it here. So for instance, so a basic example is the assault ability. So this one is our version of XCOM's run and gun. So move for 2 AP and still shoot. And the context is very clear here. So you have no flanking position in the 1 AP range, but you have a flanking position in the 2 AP range. So okay, if I'm in this situation, I know I should use this ability. And you should try to have all abilities have a context like this. Missing context has been, in my experience, the thing that broke abilities, that made them useless. So we had abilities that on paper seemed very effective and interesting, cool, but there just was no clear context in the situation in the game where the player would naturally just decide to use it. And do synergy later. So for a while we tried to design abilities around, some interaction between them, and it always ended badly, because we had no guarantees that the synergy would really work, that it would emerge, and we also had no guarantees that the abilities themselves, when you use them individually, would be cool. So then we decided, no, let's focus on making the abilities really cool on their own, and we still got to do synergy later. It often emerged organically, so often just turned out, oh crap, this ability and this ability, they actually do something cool if you use them together. And sometimes took just a little push. So as I said, this lure ability, which we changed so it would instantly cause an enemy to move, this change actually caused something cool, because we have also this body swap ability, which makes enemies treat other enemies as a PC, and there's Overwatch. So what happens if you use a body swap and then the lure? You can actually send the enemy into other enemy Overwatch, he disables the Overwatch for you, and hopefully dies in the process. So we didn't have to actively engineer the abilities towards this. This opportunity emerged, and we did a few little tweaks. And usually we made abilities cost 1 action point and not end the turn, so the player actually finds always the time and opportunity to use the abilities alongside movement or shooting. And okay, how's the time? Okay, so let's do it fast. So with enemies, we chose this player-centric design as well. So they're designed as challenges, problems to overcome. They must all destabilize a certain player strategy, actually. So for instance, as I said, we wanted this game to be about movement, so the player usually is motivated to move ahead. But, okay, if the player constantly just moves ahead and wins, what we want to do now is an enemy who keeps you from doing that. So for instance, we made this Firestarter, who's the opposite. So something's pushing you ahead, but suddenly this Firestarter pops up, who's a tank, who's very dangerous at close range, and he actually covers the level in flames. So this creates an interesting problem. And I instantly have to actually use abilities and think strategically to overcome this. And especially when we start combining enemies who destabilize different strategies, then we get a very complex situation to resolve for the player. And yeah, and obviously we made them pretty distinct and clear and recognizable. So it's pretty clear this guy is, well, has a flamethrower. Yeah, and usually we try to make sure that two hard counters exist. So abilities that if you use them, they will pretty much neutralize the threat from the enemy. But of course you can still defeat the enemy with other means, but it's more difficult. So yeah, one example I'm pretty proud of mechanically is the Fume. So this is an enemy who actually is shrouded in smoke. You can shoot him from a distance, but he can shoot at you. So what he instantly does, he attracts you. So you punch him on the nose in the smoke. And this also creates an interesting team dynamic instantly, because one character has to charge ahead, but the others have to finish him off, else the guy who charged ahead to punch him on the nose is exposed. So I'm pretty proud of the dynamics that's created in the game. And of course we added these hard counters which I mentioned. So for instance, you can just throw a grenade into the smoke, or we have abilities like IR goggles which neutralize the smoke, or the sabotage ability which disables the smoke. So he's easy enough to kill on his own, but of course if you combine him with different enemies, well, then it becomes interesting. Okay, I'm going to skip the last slide. It wasn't very important anyway. So yeah, the end. Thank you.